Youth Disability Radio.
Coast FM 963, you're on Raw Youth Disability Radio. And joining us on the line right now is an incredibly special guest indeed. You may know him from our childhoods as the original Yellow Wiggle, or for more recently, his Activision with Heart of the Nation. The incredible Wiggly Greg Paige is joining us on the line right now. How are you today, Greg?
Yeah, good, thanks, guys. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Absolute honour to have you on the show. I think it's no understatement when I say you're probably the biggest guest we've had on Raw, so congratulations.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's nice to be with you.
Yeah, and joining alongside me also here today in the interviewer's chair is our resident Wiggles expert and superfan, Ben Kemsley. How are you going, Ben?
I'm good, thank you, Angus. How are you going?
I'm very well, thank you. Not as excited as you. Well, obviously I'm excited, but no one can surpass your excitement today to meet your hero.
Well, I tell you what, everyone has been excited about this, including myself, so...
Yeah, for sure. It's an absolute honour, and the day has finally come. So, Ben, since you're the guy that put this whole thing together, and you know everything inside and out about the Wiggles, and Greg, I'll hand it over to you to ask him some questions.
For sure. Greg, you were a roadie for the Cockroaches. Can you please tell us how you ended up studying early childhood teaching to becoming a Wiggle?
Pretty long story, actually, Ben. So, look, I was a fan of the Cockroaches to begin with, and I did work experience through my school with the Cockroaches. I ended up getting a bit more of a full-time sort of job with them, and Anthony sort of pulled me aside one day and said, well, Greg, you're young. What do you want to do when you're older? I said, well, I want to be a roadie. And he said to me, well, you can't really be a roadie when you're 50. He said, I mean, you can be, but you're going to have a sore back from lugging gear, and you don't want to carry gear up and down stairs every day. And to be fair to Anthony, he's right. I'm now 51, and yeah, I don't want to be a roadie, but I'm 50. So luckily he said to me back then, what else do you want to do? And I said, well, I wouldn't mind being a teacher because you can use music with teaching. And so Anthony said, why don't you think about early childhood teaching? And I hadn't thought about that. I'd thought about becoming a primary school teacher. And when Anthony said, why don't you become a preschool or early childhood teacher, he said, come to my university and have a look because there's 300 women and only 5 men. So well, that's a pretty good ratio of women to men. So that's what sold me on it.
Also, when you were at university, well, actually, no, I think it might have been after that, you were still living at home and Anthony called you and said he wanted to get together.
I think it was the end of first year of uni, so I was still at uni, but I was living at home, and Anthony rang and said, look, why don't we write and record some songs for children? So we did that. We wrote some songs, and Rockabye Your Bear is one of the very first songs that we wrote. And really what we had intended to be our demo tape to submit to a record company, we submitted, but they actually released it. So what you hear on the Wiggles' very first CD or audio cassette back in the day, that was just a demo, and it was good enough apparently to be released.
Wow, yeah. Now, Greg, obviously the Wiggles have had a number of iconic dance moves and that are recognised worldwide today, and I'm sure for our listeners would love to know, how did you guys come up with the most iconic move, the Wiggles fingers?
That one, well, we actually saw a couple of 10-pin bowlers doing something like that. They were doing this without the thumbs. I think they were doing that on TV one day. So we used to do a lot of touring around regional Australia, and we'd have the weekends off. So we'd have Saturday and Sunday just sitting in our hotel rooms trying to kill some time. And when the cricket was on, so when the test matches were on, in the lunch break, they'd play 10-pin bowling episodes of like Australian 10-pin bowling. And there were these 2 10-pin bowlers that used to do this when they got a strike. And then one day, Murray came on stage and did this. He did that. And we all went, wow, that's really cool. And so it just stuck.
Yeah, for sure. Obviously, the Wiggles, like when you guys first started, you started doing small shows around Australia in the 90s. When did you guys first realise how popular you were getting, not just in Australia, but worldwide?
It was probably 1992, actually, halfway through 92. We were doing shows and people could pay the Wiggles. So I think we were charging $300 or $500, something like that. Very small amount, a lot of money back then, I guess. And they could book us to play somewhere. And so somebody booked us to play at a town hall, and they sold tickets for it, and they made the profit, right? And when we saw how many tickets they'd sold and what we were getting paid, we went, well, hang on, a lot of people are paying to come and see us. We should be putting on these shows, and we should be making more money than what we're charging here. And so that's when we kind of realised that we were onto something that was going to be a little bit successful. it took a couple of years after that, so probably about 1999 or maybe even 2000, when we started airing on the Disney Channel in the US. That's when we realised that in the US we were onto something quite big.
Yeah, well, it would have been like a big shock, knowing that people from all over the world that wanted to see you guys as well.
Yeah, it was. It was a real shock, but it was a nice surprise, actually.
Yeah, and I think you guys sold out 12, 13 shows at Madison Square Garden in a year, something like that?
Yeah, in a week, actually. We did 13 shows in a week, I think it might have been. Yeah, and that's an interesting one too. So a lot of people say Madison Square Garden and they think of that big arena. Yeah. It wasn't the arena, it was the theatre at Madison Square Garden. And that holds about 5,000 people. So 13 times 5, what's that, 65,000. So we actually could have sold the arena 3 times over, to be honest. But,
wow.
We didn't do the arena 13 times, but we could have done it 3 times.
Yeah. Obviously, the Wiggles have had a huge impact on a lot of people's, childhoods growing up in the 90s and early 2000s. What does it mean for you to have inspired so many people like myself and other people?
Well, it's an incredible honour, and it's something we never kind of anticipated or imagined. And I guess even, once I left the Wiggles, you don't really think about the fact that you've been a part of so many people's lives.
Yeah.
And then to hear it later, and now to do the OG Wiggles shows and have people like yourself come along and relive their childhood, I think it's such a privilege, that we are held in such high regard by people like yourself and associated with, hopefully good times of your life when you're a child and young and carefree and just, innocent and living life. I think as we become adults, we lose touch with that inner child in a lot of cases because we get connected to the pressures of living. We have a mortgage, we have a job, we've got all those things that we kind of feel we have to do, and we lose that beauty and the innocence of being a child. So for people to be able to come along to an OG Wiggles show and just be that child again, I think is so magical.
Well, speaking of the OG Wiggles tour that you guys have been doing the last couple of years, have you noticed the shirt that Ben's wearing today?
I did see that, yeah. It's a very, very appropriate shirt to be wearing, Ben.
Yeah, Greg, I noticed you had a new documentary out called Hot Potato, the story of the Wiggles, and the launch was a pretty big deal. And what's the feedback been like on it?
Well, as far as I know, the feedback's been pretty good. Got a lot of good reviews. Yeah, I think it gave people an insight into the Wiggles that they probably didn't know. And I think one of the key bits of feedback we've had is that people didn't really understand how much of our early childhood teaching background went into creating the Wiggles and the songs and the shows, the TV shows, the live shows. I think that was probably an eye-opening moment for a lot of people just to understand how much thought went into creating everything.
Yeah, some real underground stuff and an incredible doco as well. If anyone hasn't seen it, I believe it's on Amazon Prime. And it's an absolute beautiful watch. To get more in depth into the reasons behind Heart of the Nation, we'd like to ask a few questions to Greg about the health issues he's suffered over the last 20 years or so. And to do that, I'll pass it straight back over to our resident Wiggles expert, Ben Kemsley.
Thank you, Angus. So, Greg, during your career, from all the travelling and constant performing, would have taken its toll, and unfortunately you developed some health issues during that time. One of them is called orthostatic intolerance. And for those who don't know, could you please let us know a bit more about it and the impact of living with that condition?
Yeah, so orthostatic intolerance is what they call a dysautonomic disease, so a dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system. Yeah. So our autonomic nervous system controls things we don't have to think about. It's automatic, basically. So things like breathing, blood pressure, heart rate, all those kinds of things. So I developed this thing called orthostatic intolerance, and essentially it became worse because of all the sweat that I lost over the years performing with the Wiggles. I became chronically dehydrated. And when you're dehydrated, you don't have enough blood volume, so your blood pressure drops, particularly when you go from sitting to standing. So there was one time backstage with the Wiggles in 2006, we were doing a meet and greet, and I was kneeling down to talk to the kids, and then I stood up and I just basically blacked out because my blood pressure wasn't what it should have been. So that's orthostatic intolerance. And I ended up leaving the group in 2006 until I got a diagnosis after I'd left the group, and then got on the track to having to rebuild my health and get a lot better after that.
What did you do to manage your health and recover from that illness?
probably the biggest thing to help recover was the fact I wasn't touring anymore and losing all that sweat. But I was on medication for a while. I used to have to drink, I used to have to drink 4 litres of Gatorade every day to build up the hydration again, get the salt back into my body. Biggest thing, ironically, that helped me was the decision to leave the group and not be losing so much fluid every day.
If I could jump in for just a second, with orthostatic intolerance and like you said, it being such a dehydrating sort of illness to have, was it like a constant thing year round, or did it hit you harder in summer compared to winter?
It does become worse in summer because you're dehydrated. So if I have a game of cricket, if I'm outside playing cricket, I get dehydrated. Sitting down and then stand up, I'll probably collapse pretty quickly.
Yeah, wow. And in those years that you spent away from the Wiggles and touring, performing, kind of resting, relaxing, recharging, recovering, the 4 R's, I guess, did you feel as though at any point you could return to the Wiggles?
It was probably after a while, yeah. And then the guys asked me to come back in 2012, actually. So by that point, I was feeling I could, but there was still a bit of apprehension really about it, because it was like, well, okay, if I do it again, if I'm going to be losing so much fluid, am I going to get back to that point? But no, that was fine that year, so that worked out really well. Apart from the whole changeover thing with Sam, that didn't go so well, but apart from that, the touring went well.
From there, like, you guys all got together for a short time in 2012. Was it a health-based decision to disband again the second time?
For me, I was only ever back for 8 months. I was back from January to August, and then they were going to change over to another Wiggle anyway. But then partway through that year, Murray and Jeff decided to leave at the end of that year. So it made sense, rather than me leave in August again, it made sense for me to stay on till December, and the three of us would kind of retire together.
Yeah, and, since then, as you mentioned earlier, like, the OG Wiggles have done reunion shows, and there was that time where you got together in 2020 to do a concert for bushfire relief, and it went very well right up until the very end when you had that scary moment on stage. Would you be able to explain to us what happened that night?
Yeah, well, like, as you say, the show was going really well. I don't really remember a lot of it, unfortunately, but as I was leaving the stage, I had a massive heart attack that sent me into cardiac arrest. So my heart stopped beating, and essentially I dropped dead and needed to be resuscitated. So, like, for me, luckily, I didn't know what was going on, but unfortunately for the people around me, they were very concerned and panicked, and fortunately there were people around who knew what to do, and they were able to call 000. They were able to start CPR, and very luckily the venue, Castle Hill RSL, had an AED or defibrillator accessible for my responders, and they were able to use that and get my heart restarted just as the paramedics were arriving. So, a very scary moment, but one that fortunately turned out very well for me. Yeah,
it's like it had a positive ending.
Yeah, and, the tragic thing is that for most people it's not positive, unfortunately. I'm 1 in 10 to survive. 90% of people don't survive. So I think that was probably the real thing that impacted me the most when I woke up in hospital, to be told I was 1 in 10 to survive, and that's really what spawned the birth of Heart of the Nation.
Yeah, and speaking of which, that's a fantastic segue, because it's time for us to take another break. But when we come back, we'd love to have a final chat with Greg all about his amazing charity, Heart of the Nation, that was spawned by the super duper scary incident we just had a little bit of a chat about. So we'll be right back.
Coast FM's Raw Youth Disability Radio.
Coast FM 963, you're on Raw Youth Disability Radio, and we've been having a wiggly good time tonight, being joined on the line by the incredible OG Yellow Wiggle and founder of an incredible charity, Heart of the Nation, Greg Paige, who is still with us right now. Now, before the break, we delved a little bit into the numerous unfortunate health issues that Greg has had throughout the last 20 years, from orthostatic intolerance to his unfortunate cardiac arrest that he had on stage during the bushfire relief concert a couple of years ago. But it's not all bad news, because from that incident, some real good has come out of it. Greg's amazing charity, Heart of the Nation. Ben Kemsley, our resident Wiggles expert, is on hand right now to ask him a few questions about that.
Thank you, Angus. Greg, so you founded up a charity called Heart of the Nation. Could you tell our listeners a bit about it?
Yeah, so it was really founded to raise awareness about sudden cardiac arrest and what that is. But more importantly then, for people to be able to feel confident to be able to respond when somebody is in cardiac arrest, because a lot of people think you need to be trained in how to do CPR, or you need to be trained in how to use an AED, but in fact you don't. Anybody can try to do CPR, anybody can use an AED without any training at all. And that's really why Heart of the Nation exists, to make sure that those two key messages are out there, that any attempt at resuscitation is better than no attempt.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't actually know the difference between a heart attack and a cardiac arrest. Could you please explain to our listeners the difference between?
Yeah, so a heart attack is a plumbing problem with the heart. So one of the arteries in the heart, one or more, become blocked or narrowed, and it restricts the blood flow to the heart muscle. So the person who's having the heart attack, their heart is actually still beating, it's still pumping. But someone who's in cardiac arrest, it's usually an electrical problem with the heart. And when that electrical problem exists, the heart is no longer pumping, because it's the electrical system of the heart that tells the heart how to beat. If the heart's not beating, the person doesn't survive. So the heart needs to be restarted and the electrical problem needs to be reset. So CPR is important because CPR pushes blood around the body, but it's the shock from an AED or defibrillator that will actually get the heart restarted in most cases of cardiac arrest. And that's why it's important that people understand that a heart attack is not the same thing as a cardiac arrest, and that when someone is in cardiac arrest, it's important to call 000, start CPR and use an AED as quickly as possible, because those three things give someone the very best chance of surviving.
That's it. Obviously, with Heart of the Nation, I also learnt that 10% of people in Australia survive a sudden cardiac arrest every year, and you're obviously 1 in 10, and 90% of people don't survive it at all, and that experience. So what can we do to raise that survival stat?
The very first thing is what we're doing now, talking about it, making sure people understand what the problem is and that the solution is actually literally in our hands. Yeah. Literally, it's anybody can do CPR. So just put your hands on somebody's chest. When somebody's not responding, call 000. If they're not breathing normally or at all, start CPR and use an AED as quickly as you can, because time is absolutely of the essence when it comes to cardiac arrest. And so it is up to everyday community members like you and me, and so that's how we can solve this problem and see more people surviving. So talking about it, raising awareness and letting people know that literally the solution is in our hands.
Yeah, and recently you've been touring the Central Coast, pubs and clubs, providing them with AEDs. How important is it to have AEDs in the venues? It's
really important to have venues with AEDs. I was at one when I had my cardiac arrest, right? So if it wasn't there, I probably wouldn't have survived. So thanks to Wyong Leagues Club, they actually funded the rollout of, it's 14 in total, but on the Central Coast, I think there's probably about 8 or 9 up there on the Central Coast. Clubs now that have an AED on the outside of the club that can be accessed 24/7, because up to 80% of cardiac arrests happen at home. So it's important that we have them at clubs, but if you're inside the club, you can still access that one that's on the outside. But importantly, if you live near that club and somebody nearby the club has a cardiac arrest, that can be accessed 24/7. So that's how we're going to save more lives, by having these devices accessible to the whole community, not just people inside a building. Because when that club is closed, that AED would not be available unless it's outside the club. So that's why it's so important what Wyong Leagues have done, funded these AEDs to be placed on the outside for community members to be able to access them.
And with Wyong Leagues, of course, that includes clubs such as my local, Canton Beach Sports Club, Baddo Bay Bowling Club, for example, the main one, Wyong Leagues Club. So any one of those groups has one of these amazing AEDs from Heart of the Nation. And Greg, you were there for the opening. Amazing to see you in my hometown.
Yes, it was great. I was there. I was able to get photos and talk to the staff and the team members about AEDs and how simple they are to use, because you don't need to be trained to use one. So again, this is an important point to talk about, the fact that if you're at a shopping centre, if you're at a club, if you're somewhere and somebody collapses and there's an AED there, you can use it. If you don't know anything about it, just turn it on and it will tell you what to do.
Yeah, and obviously, Greg, Heart of the Nation has been a big inspiration to me and all the community on the Central Coast and pretty much everywhere around Australia. You've done so much with Heart of the Nation. What are your hopes for the future?
My end goal is that Heart of the Nation won't have to exist. Right? My end goal is that we've done our job and educated the community. We have processes in place where people know that they can get access to an AED 24/7. We get to this point where people are placing these outside their businesses so anyone can access them any time of the day or night. And we get to the point where people know that it doesn't matter if you're trained in CPR or not. If somebody's not responding, just call 000. If they're not breathing normally or at all, start CPR and use the AED. It's that simple. Now, I say it's simple. It's probably very hard to do because it's going to be a very confronting situation. But if you understand that you don't need special training, you don't need any special qualifications to try and save somebody's life, you'll be able to try a lot more easily and feel more comfortable to do it because you know that anybody can be a superhero.
Yeah, and it's all about, having a go and trying to save a life.
That's it, yeah. And anyone can do it.
Yeah. Greg, one more question before we wrap up. Where can we go to find more information on Heart of the Nation?
You can find us on the web, heartofthenation.com.au. That's the best place to find us. There's lots of information there about sudden cardiac arrest, CPR and AEDs, and information about the programs and initiatives that we run too that help empower the community by helping them find AEDs more rapidly at times of need.
Well, fantastic.
Excellent.
Heart of the Nation is an amazing charity. Greg Paige, you are an amazing guy. We're also lucky, not just us, but the whole country, that you're still alive and wiggling after your unfortunate experience. And it's amazing to see you're doing so many awesome things with it since with Heart of the Nation. It's been so incredible to have you on our show tonight and meet you in person and have a chat about your life, career, and what you've been doing since. Myself and Ben, of course, are so honoured to have you, and thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, there you have it. In the flesh, on the radio, the Yellow Wiggle OG himself, Greg Paige, finally on the show on Raw, making myself and Ben Kemsley's dreams come true. What an awesome chat that was, and what an amazing inspiration he is. He had an insanely traumatic experience. He nearly died, and he has turned that around since, and he is using his power for good with Heart of the Nation. And if you would like to find out more information about Heart of the Nation and Greg Paige, you can head to our Facebook page. Just look up Coast FM 963. Scroll down till you see the promo post for tonight's episode of Raw. You'll see Ben and I wearing our wiggly outfits. There are links on there to the Wiggles, Heart of the Nation, and Greg Paige's very own Facebook pages, as well as the Heart of the Nation website that Greg just mentioned as well. Thank you so much, Greg. One of the biggest VIPs we've ever had on this show. It was an awesome time.